So as mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about dairy manure and a sugar beet rotation, particularly liquid separated dairy manure. This is manure that is separated from the solids using a screw press. And these screw presses are being used more and more by the larger dairies that we're seeing coming into the sugar beet growing region. Here's a photo of what these screw presses look like. The solids are actually recycled back into the barns, at least a certain portion is. Some of them are potentially applied to fields, but then the liquids will then be stored and put out onto the fields in the fall. So we have two different study locations, one in central Minnesota near Murdock, Minnesota, and this is in its second year of the trials. We also have a site that's further north in Nashua, Minnesota, that's in the first year of the trial. Basically what we did is we applied manure in the fall of 2019 in our central Minnesota site near Murdock, and we applied fall manure in 2020 to go into our growing season at Nashua. Now, all of these dairies, at least right now, what they're offering is different rates of manure. So they'll have a high rate, which is about 15,000 gallons per acre, and a low rate, which is about 10,000. And this fluctuates from year to year. They're basically choosing what rate they will offer based on their manure tests from the previous year, from what I understand. So we wanted to test those two rates, and we wanted to apply it before 3 crops in a rotation, either sugar beet, soybean, or corn, to kind of try to see where would be the best opportunity to use this manure if growers wanted to use it. And then we compared that to a spring fertilizer. Obviously, there's going to be different nutrients added in a high rate and a low rate. So we did balance nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium needs across the fields based on soil tests for phosphorus and potassium. And for nitrogen, we took the credit for the manure and then added more nitrogen if needed, depending on if it was the sugar beet or the corn. For soybean, obviously, we did not add any additional nitrogen. Then going into the second and third year, we continued the rotation. So the sugar beet always followed corn and soybean always followed sugar beet. In the second year, we did take a second year credit for the manure nitrogen, and then we used the soil tests for P and K to adjust fertilizer needs for each of the different crops. And we did hand apply the manure in this case. Here's my staff applying the manure up at our Nashua site. We got really lucky. It ended up being 70 degrees in November on the day we went to apply manure. So they actually do look happy. I didn't force them to smile for the photo. But we applied this by hand and tried to incorporate it. I believe the one site we incorporated the next morning, this Nashua site, we were able to incorporate that evening. This helped us use smaller plots and be able to kind of just assess whether there's differences just because of the manure, and we didn't have to, didn't consider compaction from a tanker application system here. So as I mentioned, we had all 3 crops every year. So here's kind of an aerial photograph of our Murdock site after the first year. So each row has soybeans, corn, or sugar beet. And then we have 4 different replicates of each. Within each of these, we have strips of high rate of manure, a strip of low rate manure, and then a strip of fertilizer. And that's very similar to what we did up at the Nashua site as well. So here's a photo of our Murdock site the first year. This is taken in July 2020. We did start seeing some issues with our soybean almost to the row where we applied manure. You can see that we had problems. In this case, the soil near Murdock had a high pH. It was about 8, had a high organic matter. And we think we were seeing iron deficiency chlorosis with the soybean. Typically when you have a lot of nitrate in high pH soils, that can block iron from being taken up by the soybean, and also organic matter. And nitrate or manure is potentially providing both the organic matter and nitrate into the soil. So that's why we are thinking that this was iron deficiency chlorosis. We did not apply soy green in this particular year, or a product that would help chelate the iron. because we didn't anticipate that this would be a problem. So otherwise, the sugar beets looked really good in our manure and fertilizer plots. In fact, where manure had been applied, the sugar beet rows closed a little more quickly, and the corn looked really good, regardless of the nutrient source as well. Now coming into 2021, this is the same site, but you can see the crops have changed in each of their areas. For instance, this was sugar beet this first year, and it's soybean the second year. And you can see we're still having some patchy issues with iron deficiency chlorosis. It wasn't as bad. We did apply soy green in this particular year to help combat some of the issues we were seeing. It did seem kind of random throughout the field. The only one was this third rep that you see up here. We did have a problem, especially with our low manure applied rate, where it just kind of toasted all of the soybeans there. But otherwise, sugar beets looked really good. Corn looked really good, despite it being a drought year. We also started Nashua. Our first crop season was 2021. So this is what it looks like for this first year. We did not see any issues at all with soybean after manure was applied at this site. The soil pH was a little bit lower. I think it was around 7.4, 7.5. We also made sure to choose a soybean variety that had higher resistance to IDC. So we think that those helped. Corn looked really good. At first, it was looking really rough because of the droughts, but once we got those rains, I think there was a rain in late July, and then in August, again, everything really shot up and recovered much more nicely than it was looking kind of early in the season. One thing we did notice is, and we found out like literally days before planting, we had already applied manure. We found out that Callisto had been applied to this field the previous year, and that has a holdback period of, I'm not a weed scientist, but I think you shouldn't be applying sugar beets or planting sugar beets within 18 months of it. And unfortunately, that was the situation we found ourselves in. So they did use a higher planting rate and planted into it anyways. We decided to push forward, just kind of see, what would happen, because we had already applied the manure. And overall, things seemed to push through pretty well. We were pretty pleased with the stand that we got, despite Callisto having been on the field. So I'll get directly into our yields. This is our Murdoch site first year. So manure was fall applied in 2019, and this is the 2020 growing season. Overall, here's corn yields on the left, and at the bottom, you'll see our spring fertilizer versus manure low rate, which is about 10,000 gallons per acre, and manure high rate, which is about 15,000 gallons per acre. Overall, we did not see a statistical difference in yield. Where manure had been applied tended to have slightly higher yields, but there was enough variability across the plots that we could not detect a statistical difference. But we had applied, similar nitrogen rates, like even the low rate, we supplemented with nitrogen if needed. So we didn't expect there to be much differences. Here's our soybean yield. Unfortunately, where manure had been applied really toasted our soybeans. We were getting 13 or 8 bushels per acre, and it did tend to be a little bit lower with that high rate. So there was a statistical difference, and you can see I have some letters above these bars. Anywhere where any bar that has a letter different from another bar means it's statistically different from that bar. So here our fertilizer plots did yield a lot better. And just a reminder, fertilizer plots did not have nitrogen. They did have phosphorus and potassium added as needed based on soil tests, but no additional nitrogen. And then here's our sugar beet yields from that first year. We have our nutrient source over here. Fertilizer only is the top row, low dairy manure rate is the middle row, and the bottom is the high dairy rate. We have our yield. This is root yield in tons per acre, extractable sugar in pounds per ton, extractable sugar in pounds per acre, and sugar purity. Overall, again, we have these letters here within each group. Within each of these columns, if you have the same letter, then there's no statistical difference. So we did not see differences in root yield, although manure tended to have slightly higher root yields. Extractable sugar was similar, although it tended to be slightly lower. Extractable sugar in pounds per acre tended to be a little bit higher with our manure rates, but again, there was enough variability that we did not detect a statistical difference. Now, sugar purity, we did have a bit of a difference. It was 91.2 in our fertilizer only plots, down to 90.8 essentially with our high dairy manure rate. What's interesting is we found almost the exact same numbers in another trial, which I'll show you shortly here, and that was not statistically different. It just deals with some of the variability that we saw across the plots. And this particular year, these numbers were a lot tighter than in other years. But overall, it's like a 0.4% purity difference. Here is our second year at Murdoch. So manure had been applied in fall of 2019. This is the growing season of 2021. We took a manure credit depending on how much total nitrogen was applied in the first year. I believe it was about 25% of that total nitrogen we credited for the second year, and then adjusted fertilizer rates based on those, as well as the soil tests for each of the different treatments. So here in our second year, we did actually see a bit of a yield increase. The high manure rate plots increased yield over the fertilizer only plots. We got 157 bushels per acre for corn yield where fertilizer only was applied, and 185 bushels per acre where the manure high rate was applied. And then the manure low rate was kind of somewhere in between the two. Some of the reasons for that is that potentially we could have had more nitrogen supplied by that second year credit than we had planned. It could be that these fields had not had manure. So in a drought year that we had for 2021, perhaps that high rate of manure added enough additional organic matter that it was helping retain any of the soil moisture that we possibly had. There's a couple of different things. There's also potentially micronutrients, secondary nutrients that were lasting, and we're getting a second year bump from those compared to the fertilizer only plots. So a couple different things to consider. Soybean yields looked much better at this Murdoch site the second year. They were averaging about 32, 34 bushels per acre. We did see a little bit of a decrease in that manure low rates, and we primarily think it was because that one replicate especially seemed to be impacted by this. But you can see there's a lot of variability. These error bars or standard deviation bars are very high, meaning that we saw a lot of variability across the field in these soybean plots. Second year for our sugar beets, our root yield was about 40 tons per acre, is pretty consistent. Extractable sugar ranged from 270 to 272 pounds per ton. Our extractable sugar in pounds per acre was 10.8 thousand versus 11,000. So, all pretty, or sorry, 10,800 compared to 11,000, all pretty similar. And sugar purity was a little bit lower, but not by much for our high dairy rate. And there was enough variability that we did not detect a statistical difference. So overall, it's looking pretty decent for manure applications in front of sugar beet, or 2 years in front of sugar beet, at least in front of this site. Moving on to Nashua, this is our further north site. Here we have our corn yields. We were really pleased. We got really nice corn yields up at Nashua, 230 bushels per acre. In our case, the manure was slightly lower at 209 or 228 bushels per acre, but these were not different enough to see a statistical difference. And soybean yields, actually, the soybeans in this site actually seem to really do well in the manure, where manure had been applied the previous fall. Again, there was a lot of variability, so we did not see a statistical difference here. But it tended to be, 5 to 9 bushels per acre higher where manure had been applied. And here we have our sugar beet yields. Same graphic as before, fertilizer low, high rates of manure. Our root yield ranged from 39.5 to 41.4, and the manure plots, especially the high rate, tended to be slightly higher. It was not statistically different than where we applied fertilizer. Our extractable sugar in pounds per acre was very similar across plots, and our sugar purity, again, this is almost exactly the same as what we saw at Murdoch in our first year after manure application. Sugar purity was 91.2% in our fertilizer-only plots and 90.8% in our high dairy rate manure. But in this case, we did not detect a statistical difference. The variability was a little bit higher in these plots. So to summarize, in year one, corn yield, sugar beet root yield, and extractable sugar were very similar across all treatments. Sugar purity maybe was slightly lower by about 0.4% where the high rate of manure was applied, and that was pretty consistent. And manure tended to improve soybean yield at Nashua, but it dramatically decreased yield at Murdoch. So there's something to be said about thinking about iron deficiency chlorosis if you're using manure in a system on these high pH soils. In year two, we only have the one site so far, and so far we did not find an effect of the history, manure versus fertilizer history, on corn, soybean, or sugar beet at the one site. And our second site, Nashua, will have our second year coming up next year. And finally, year three, we do plan on going the full 3 years in this. We'll have more details on that after the 2020 growing season for Murdoch and the 2023 growing season for our Nashua site. So thank you, especially thank you to the Sugar Beet Research and Education Board of Minnesota and North Dakota for funding this. I will be around for a little bit today. I do have to head out at the lunch break. So here's my contact information. Follow me on Twitter. And I did start putting some updates for the project where you can find more details at this Z-link, z.umn.edu, manure sugar beet rotation 2021, if you want to check that out. But otherwise, I think I'm done. And I think I got you back on time, hopefully.